The snow had not yet settled for good, but it stalked the ridges like a gray wolf, silent, sure, and waiting. Down in the Green River Valley, a scattering of trappers moved through the yellowing willows, their mules loaded with beaver plews, stiff from frost. The season was dying early. Every man in that remnant party knew it. They were the leftovers of a better year, what was left of Smith and Sublette's old company after Pierre's hole had scattered them to the wind. The talk of good trapping along the Snake had dried up with the fur, and the mountains had grown hungrier. Elias Boone Hardesty rode at the rear, his rifle balanced across the saddle horn, the brim of his battered felt hat pulled low against the wind. He was 30 years old and looked older. The mountains aged men faster than whiskey or bullets. His hands were cracked, his beard streaked with frost, and the long scar beneath his left eye gift of a Blackfoot lance 2 winters earlier twitched when the wind turned cold. They had been following a faint smoke column since morning, believing it to be a small Comanche war band that had crossed the plains to raid the Shoshone horse camps. The Comanches seldom ranged this far north, but the world was changing tribes, driven by trade, by hunger, by the metal and powder that now defined worth. By afternoon, the trappers found what they'd been tracking: 3 dead ponies, 2 burned travois poles, and a narrow gulch still stinking of powder smoke. Hardesty swung down, boots sinking in half-frozen mud. "Looks fresh," he muttered. "Too fresh," said Francois Leclerc, a thin French-Canadian with eyes like chips of ice. "Them Comanche don't die easy." The gulch was shallow, the kind that gathered brush and bones. 2 bodies lay twisted among the sage, one white, one dark. The first was a boy of perhaps 17, wearing the tatters of a trader's frock and moccasins stitched with crow beadwork. The other was a Comanche, broad-shouldered, his face painted in red clay, now streaked with rain. His horse had been shot from under him. Its carcass pinned his leg. Hardesty knelt beside the Comanche. The man's eyes were half open, cloudy but fierce even in death. Around his neck hung a necklace of wolf teeth and Spanish silver coins, black with age. The trapper loosened the saddlebag still slung over the dead mule's flank and drew it free. Leclerc frowned. "You robbing the dead now, Elias?" "Not robbing," Hardesty said quietly. "Reconnaissance." He unbuckled the flap and spilled the contents onto a blanket: a horn powder flask, a half-empty pouch of dried meat, a rosary with 1 bead missing, and a folded piece of parchment tied in rawhide. The paper was brittle, yellowed like old skin, and stained with something darker along the edges. Hardesty worked it open carefully. It was a map or something that aspired to be one. The ink had bled in places, but he could still make out a rough line of mountains, drawn with a monk's patience, and a river curling like a snake from the south. Near the center, a cross was marked in red ochre, beneath which someone had written a word in looping Spanish: Mina del Sol. Leclerc leaned in. "What's that mean?" "Mine of the sun," Hardesty murmured. The others laughed. "Spanish foolery," said Bill Kramer, a Pennsylvanian whose fingers were permanently stained from setting traps. "Them friars drew plenty such maps when they was chasing gold ghosts in the desert." Hardesty said nothing. His eyes traced the mountains, drawn on the parchment. He recognized the outlined jagged teeth rising north of the Green River, the Wind River Range. He'd crossed it once with Smith's men, near the same valley where a dozen trappers froze when their horses gave out. If the map was true, the cross lay deep in those peaks, beyond the line of snow that even the Shoshone called cursed. He folded the parchment and tucked it into his coat. "We'll take it back to camp," Leclerc spat. "You put faith in that paper? Might as well follow a ghost's tracks." "Maybe," Hardesty said, "but ghosts sometimes leave gold behind." That night the wind came down off the peaks hard enough to make the fire crawl sideways. The trappers huddled under their robes, their mules tethered close for warmth. The valley echoed with coyotes and the distant groan of the river under ice. Hardesty sat apart, the map on his knee, studying it by firelight. The ink shimmered like old blood. He thought of Jedediah Smith, how he'd once carried his own map, hand-drawn and stained with sweat, across the deserts of California, tracing rivers no white man had seen. Smith had called maps the bones of knowledge. Hardesty had believed that once. But somewhere between the Platte and the Yellowstone, he'd learned that bones broke, and the mountains forgot who left them there. Still, there was something in this parchment that stirred him. The careful hand, the faith in symbols. Someone, maybe a priest, maybe a miner, had walked those same canyons before him, believing that the earth could be translated onto skin and ink. He turned it over. On the back, faint lines of script appeared under the fire's flicker, written in both Spanish and Latin. He could not read them all, but one phrase stood clear. Bajo la cruz, el fuego duerme. Beneath the cross, the fire sleeps. The words itched at him like a splinter. At dawn they buried the dead in the frozen ground, piling stones to keep the wolves off. Leclerc said a few words in French. The rest stood silent. Then they rode south, bound for the Green River crossing and the safety of their wintering camp. As they rode, Hardesty felt the weight of the map pressing against his chest. He told himself it was nonsense, the kind of frontier relic traders passed around to stir a man's greed. But when the clouds broke, and he saw the sun strike the high ice of the wind, river range, something in him shifted. The peaks glowed gold just for an instant, as though the mine of the sun itself had opened. Leclerc caught his stare. "You're thinking of going up there, ain't you?" Hardesty didn't answer. "Elias, don't let that paper twist your head. We got enough ghosts chasing us." Hardesty smiled thinly. "Maybe. But if the map's true, it might lead to more than ghosts." They rode on. Behind them, the wind erased their tracks, as though the mountains had already decided how the story would end. By the time they reached Horse Creek, the weather had turned. Snow began to fall in thick, wet flakes, muffling the world. The camp they'd left a week before was half buried, the log shelters sagging under white weight. Inside, their traps hung empty, their whiskey nearly gone. Hardesty spread the parchment on the rough plank table, smoothing its creases with care. The ink lines seemed clearer now, as if the storm had brought them into focus. The cross burned red even in dim light. He marked the rivers against his own memory, tracing where he'd trapped with Smith years before. The bearings matched almost perfectly. Only one feature puzzled him, a small symbol near the cross, drawn like a spiral sun. Leclerc shook his head. "You'll chase that thing till the mountains eat you." Hardesty folded the map once more. "Then I best ride before they get hungry." Outside, the storm thickened, swallowing the valley in silence. The map rested against his heart, warm as a promise. And though he would not admit it aloud, not to Leclerc, nor to any man still breathing, Elias Boone Hardesty already believed that the parchment was no myth at all. It was a calling. By December, the Green River country had folded itself under white silence. The aspen trunks stood bare as bleached ribs, and the only motion was the snow sliding slow off a pine bough or the ghost-like drift of smoke from a half-buried lodge. For the men of Elias, Boone Hardesty's party, winter came early and hard. Their traps froze solid in the creeks, and their horses pawed through ice crust for grass that wasn't there. The trappers, 5 in all, followed the Shoshone Trail northeast along the Wind River until they found a bend where the current still moved beneath clear ice. There they met a small band of eastern Shoshone who had built their winter camp among the cottonwoods. The old chief, a man named Padiwa, welcomed them with quiet courtesy. The white men had tobacco and iron kettles. The Shoshone had food and shelter. The bargain was unspoken but understood. Hardesty traded 3 pelts for a place beside the fire and a lodge to share with a Shoshone family. He learned their ways the way any man learned to stay alive, by watching. The snow fell for days without pause, and he watched how the Shoshone bent to its will instead of fighting it. Their lodges were half sunk into the earth, ringed with willow poles, covered in hide and brush, then sealed with snow until they looked like pale mounds themselves. Inside, the air stayed warm as breath, and the fires drew sweetly through vents cut by hand. One morning, while helping Padiwa's sons repair a snow shelter that had sunk under fresh weight, Hardesty saw how they shaped the drifted snow into curved braces, not straight lines. "The arch," the old man told him, "never breaks." He mimed the sweep of it with his hand. "Straight lines are for men," he said in slow trade talk, "but the mountain is round." Hardesty grinned through the steam of his breath. You speak truth, old father. That night he drew the lodge design in his journal, copying the way the roof lines curved, how the air holes were set to the leeward side, how the walls leaned inward like cupped palms. He had sketched a dozen maps in his life, but never something so simple or sure. By midwinter, Leclerc and the others had grown restless. The cold gnawed at their tempers. Whiskey was low, meat scarcer. They muttered that they should ride south to Fort Bonneville before starvation closed the pass. But the passes were already closed. Hardesty spent his days helping the Shoshone haul wood and mend snares. He had come west for beaver and gold, but what held him now was quieter, the small, fierce wisdom of survival. He watched how the Shoshone women packed snow around the lodges after each storm, sealing cracks that would have broken white men's cabins. When the wind came roaring down from the divide, the Indian lodges only tightened, like fists closing. One evening, when the sky burned low with northern lights, Leclerc stepped into Hardesty's lodge. "Elias," he said, "that map's bewitched you. We've been penned up here near 2 months. You'll freeze with your Indian friends before you find a single flake of gold." Hardesty looked up from his sketches. "Maybe gold ain't the treasure," Leclerc snorted. "Then what is? Words on paper?" Hardesty held up the journal page where he had drawn the Snow Lodge cross-section. "Knowledge," he said. "Ain't that what Jed Smith chased? The shape of a mountain, the bend of a river, the ways that let a man live where he shouldn't." Leclerc's jaw worked. "You can't sell knowledge in Street Louis." "Maybe not," Hardesty said softly, "but you can survive by it." January brought a storm so fierce that the world ceased to exist beyond arm's reach. The snow came sideways, filling the air until even sound was muffled. The Shoshone retreated into their mounds, lighting no fires by day for fear the roofs would cave. For 3 days the storm buried them. When at last it broke, the camp emerged into a world reshaped. Trees lay broken, horses gone, and 2 of the white men's cabins had collapsed entirely. The Shoshone lodges still stood, rounded and unbroken. Leclerc stood staring at the ruin, his beard crusted white. "Damn me," he muttered. "They built 'em right." Hardesty said nothing. He was looking toward the peaks, where the storm clouds lifted to reveal the high faces of the Wind River Range stone black against the snow, their slopes scarred by long white slides. Avalanches had swept whole hillsides clean. In one of those pale scars, he imagined he saw the faint line of a valley just where the red cross lay on the map. That night, he opened the parchment again. The inked ridges mirrored what he'd just seen from the frozen riverbank, the line of the snake, the fork of the wind. The cross lay near a cluster of narrow valleys that could only be the glacier fields west of Fremont Peak. Padawa noticed him studying the paper and leaned close, his old eyes narrowing. "That sign," the chief said, pointing at the red cross, "belongs to the fire that sleeps under ice." Hardesty stiffened. "You know it?" The old man nodded slowly. "My father told of white-robed men who came from the south long ago. They dug holes in the mountain to find the fire's heart. But the mountain closed on them. Their fire sleeps still." Hardesty folded the map carefully. The wind moaned through the cracks like a warning. When spring came, he told himself, he would ride into those mountains. Whatever slept there, fire or faith or gold, it was waiting. By the first thaw, the Wind River had clawed through its own ice, and the valley breathed again. Elk tracks reappeared on the ridges, and the cottonwoods leaked sap that smelled like life itself. Elias Boone Hardesty watched the river turn from white to steel gray and knew it was time to move. They broke camp in late March. The Shoshone families headed west for the salmon runs, their lodges folded neatly like the pages of a book that had been read and understood. The trappers turned south toward Fort Bonneville, a lonely stockade of squared timbers at the mouth of Horse Creek, more promise than prosperity. It had been built only the summer before by Captain Bonneville's men, though most folks still called it Fort Nonsense. Too far from the rendezvous trade, too near to ruin. Hardesty's mule carried a small pack of beaver plews, his rifle, and the Spanish parchment sealed in oiled cloth. The winter had sharpened his resolve. Every curve of the mountains, every trail the Shoshone showed him, had confirmed the map's truth in his mind. The red cross of Mina del Sol was not myth, it was direction. Fort Bonneville was half buried in spring mud when they rode in. The log walls leaned under their own weight, the bastion roof sagged, and the gate creaked like a tired jaw. Still, smoke curled from the chimneys, and the smell of coffee drifted on the wind, a civilized scent that could break a trapper's heart. Inside the yard, a handful of traders and voyageurs sorted bales of pelts. At the center, beneath a sun-bleached flag, stood a man in a long Mexican serape trimmed with fringe. His beard was gray-streaked, his hair black as pitch, and a silver crucifix hung at his throat. He turned as the trappers entered, his dark eyes sharp as obsidian. "Buenos dias, amigos," he said easily. "You come early for the trade." Hardesty dismounted. "Winter didn't leave us much choice." The man smiled faintly. "It seldom does." He offered his hand. "Miguel Arroyo, trader, sometimes interpreter. Always poor." Hardesty shook it. "Elias Hardesty, we've come from Wind River. Got pelts to sell." "Then come warm yourselves," Arroyo said, gesturing toward the trading house. "And tell me what you found in that frozen country. The mountains keep their secrets, but sometimes they whisper to strangers." They drank from tin cups beside the fire. The traders' quarters smelled of tallow, damp leather, and faint incense, a scent not common this far north. On the wall hung a painting of the Virgin, her face darkened by smoke. Arroyo noticed Hardesty's eyes linger there. "You wonder what a Mexican saint does in a place of such cold," he said. "She travels with me. I trust her more than soldiers." Hardesty smiled. "Can't fault that." He reached into his coat, hesitated, then unwrapped the parchment. "Found this in a Comanche saddlebag after a fight last fall. Thought maybe you could read the hand better'n me." Arroyo unfolded the map with care, his brow tightening as he studied the lines. The room grew still, except for the crackle of fire. Finally he exhaled softly through his nose. "I have seen this mark before," he said, touching the red cross. "Long ago, in New Mexico. My grandfather rode with a party of frailes, Franciscan friars, miners, and soldiers, seeking a vein of red ore the Indians spoke of. They called it La Mina del Sol, a mine of the sun. They never returned." Hardesty leaned forward. "You're certain?" Arroyo nodded. "Certain enough to fear it. The mountain took them. My grandfather said the peaks above the Wind River are cursed ground, where the fire sleeps under ice." Hardesty's pulse quickened. Those same words, Padilla said them. "The fire that sleeps." Arroyo's dark gaze lifted to him. "Then you have heard the warning. Men who dig where the fire sleeps find their graves instead of gold." He folded the parchment again, almost reverently. "Still, I do not doubt that such a place exists. The friars left silver tools, rosaries, relics, things that have surfaced in traders' packs for years. But the mine itself? It lies beyond God's reach." Hardesty took the map back, his fingers tracing its edges. "Or maybe beyond man's fear." Arroyo studied him for a long moment. "You are like your countrymen, always certain that courage will replace wisdom." Hardesty smiled faintly. "It's kept me breathing so far." The next morning the fort woke under thin snow flurries. Traders argued over prices, voyageurs sang rough French songs, and the mules brayed as if impatient for spring. Hardesty packed his pelts, trading most for powder, lead, and flour. But before he could ride out, Arroyo approached again, wrapped in his serape. "I have thought about your map," the trader said quietly. "If you must chase it, do not go alone. The Wind River is treacherous. Take men who have seen its glaciers." Hardesty frowned. "You offering to guide me?" Arroyo smiled thinly. "No, senor. I have learned when to let ghosts keep their ground. But I will tell you this." He drew from his coat a small silver medal engraved with a sunburst. "This came from a friar's body found by Arapaho hunters 10 winters ago near the very country your map shows. If you find more like it, turn back. It means you've stepped into their tomb." Hardesty accepted the token and slipped it into his pocket. "I'll keep that in mind." Arroyo's eyes softened. "You remind me of another man once, one who thought he could chart salvation with ink and compass. He found only a mountain that would not move." "Then I'll look for the one that will," Hardesty said. When he rode out from Fort Bonneville that afternoon, the snow had melted into rain. The river shone like glass, the peaks hidden in clouds. Behind him, the fort's gate creaked shut, and Arroyo's figure stood watching from the bastion, a dark cross against the pale horizon. Hardesty touched his coat pocket where the metal rested and glanced toward the northwest, where the Wind River rose out of the mist. He told himself he rode for curiosity, not gold, for proof, not greed. But the frontier had a way of turning both into the same thing. And far beyond the storm, somewhere beneath the sleeping fire of the mountains, the red cross of Mina del Sol waited. By midsummer the rivers ran thin again, the ice gone from their flanks, and the meadows full of blue lupine and arrowleaf balsam root. Elias Boone Hardesty left Fort Bonneville with 3 men and a promise he barely understood. The map rode in a waterproof pearl case strapped against his ribs. He could feel its shape even through his buckskin shirt, as if it pressed his heartbeat into rhythm. His party was small. Francois Leclerc, who swore he'd seen enough mountains to last 10 lives but followed anyway. Baptiste Duval, a half-Cree interpreter who knew Crow and broken Spanish. And a Crow scout named Little Elk, quiet as smoke and quick as a hawk's shadow. They followed the Sweetwater westward, then turned north into a country that rose by slow degrees toward the sky's backbone. For the first week, the air stayed soft and forgiving. They hunted antelope, caught trout in the cold bends, and slept beneath a canopy of stars that seemed close enough to touch. But by the time they reached the first glacier-fed creek, the mountains showed their true temper. The air thinned. Every breath tasted of stone. Hardesty rode at the lead, scanning the ridges against the map's lines. The drawn symbols matched too neatly to dismiss the 3. Parallel peaks, shaped like teeth, the river that bent back on itself, the high basin beyond. Each resemblance pulled him further into the old Spanish hand that had traced these same features. He began to imagine the friars themselves, tired men in wool robes, stumbling under the weight of faith and ambition, their candles guttering in wind that smelled of snow. On the 6th day they reached a narrow pass where 2 walls of granite pressed together like jaws. The trail vanished under scree and snowmelt. They dismounted and led the mules, their boots slipping on wet stone. Above, the clouds thickened, rolling eastward with a metallic growl. Leclerc spat into the wind. "I've crossed the divide before, but never with a fool chasing a ghost." Hardesty didn't answer. His gaze was fixed on the notch of the pass, where the map marked a faint cross, not the Mina del Sol itself, but a waypost, perhaps a sign the friars had left to guide the faithful. Lightning tore through the clouds, striking somewhere beyond the ridge. The mules screamed and reared. In the scramble, one lost its footing and slid backward, packs and all, into the ravine below. The echo went on for what felt like a full minute before silence took it. They climbed on, soaked and shivering, until the storm passed. At the crest, the land opened like a wound glacial valleys running north, snowfields gleaming under late light. Hardesty stopped, awed despite himself. "There," he whispered. "That's the country the map shows." Leclerc leaned on his rifle, eyes narrowed. "And if it's the same country that killed them Spaniards, maybe we best leave it buried." Baptiste shrugged. "Buried gold still shines, mon ami." Little Elk said nothing, but his gaze stayed fixed on a white slope to the west, where dark streaks marred the snow. "Avalanche path," he said softly. Mountain remembers. They camped that night in a sheltered hollow, building their fire low and narrow. The air was thin enough to make the flames tremble. Around them the peaks loomed like frozen waves. Hardesty unrolled the map again, spreading it on his knees. The firelight danced over the inked lines. The red cross seemed to pulse, a heartbeat in pigment. Baptiste leaned close. "That's the place, isn't it? The mine?" "Maybe," Hardesty said. "Or maybe just where someone wanted to die believing it." Leclerc shook his head. "You sound like a preacher, Elias. That parchment's bewitched you, same as the gold fever bewitched every damned Spaniard who ever crossed these rocks." Hardesty looked up, eyes glinting in the firelight. "Maybe so, but something brought them here, and I aimed to see what it was. Not for gold, for the truth of it." The Frenchman snorted. "Truth don't keep a man warm, nor feed his belly." "Maybe not." Hardesty said, "but it's the only thing that lives after he's gone." The fire cracked. None of them spoke for a while. Above the camp, the aurora rippled faint green along the divide, a silent curtain drawn between the world of men and whatever slept beyond. They began the descent at dawn. The ground turned treacherous patches of snow, hiding rivers of meltwater beneath. Twice the mules broke through, and twice they hauled them out by sheer stubbornness. On the third day they found what looked like an old trail etched into the slope, half swallowed by lichen. "Look here," Hardesty said, kneeling beside a carved stone set in the path. The edge bore faint markings across and the faint outline of a sunburst, worn almost smooth. Arroyo's words returned to him. "If you find more like it, turn back." Leclerc touched the stone with his gloved hand. Could be Spanish, could be Indian, could be just rock. Not just rock, Hardesty said. This was cut by man. Little Elk crouched beside them. Crow stories say this trail was made by firemen, white robes, who came before the traders. They brought thunder underground and woke the mountain spirits. The mountain buried them to sleep again. Baptiste crossed himself quietly. "Mon Dieu." Hardesty rose, looking west where the peaks gathered like storm clouds made of stone. "That's where we're going," Leclerc spat. "You'll get us all killed." "Maybe," Hardesty said. "But maybe we'll find what they lost." The Frenchman laughed bitterly. "And if you do? Then I'll finally know whether the fire sleeps or still burns." By dusk, they reached a high meadow ringed by boulders and stunted pine. The map showed one more ridge before the cross. The air smelled of iron and thunder, though the sky was clear. When night fell, the ground trembled faintly, a deep, slow pulse like a living thing far below. The men looked at one another. Even the mules shifted uneasily. Little Elk spoke first. "This is the place. The fire dreams here." Hardesty's hand went to the metal in his coat, the silver sunburst Arroyo had given him. It was warm, though the air was cold. He closed his fingers around it and felt the mountain's heartbeat echo through his palm. He did not sleep that night. The wind whispered through the passes, carrying with it voices that might have been nothing more than memory or something older, buried under the same ice that kept the world whole. When dawn came, the peaks stood crimson in the first light, and Hardesty knew they would cross that final ridge before sundown. Whatever lay beyond the truth or the curse, it was waiting for them. By late September, the days shortened like a candle burning from both ends. The trappers pushed deeper into the high country, following valleys that grew narrower and darker with each mile. Snow came early that year, dry, powdery flakes that fell without sound, erasing the trails behind them before noon. What had begun as a pursuit of cartography and faith had turned into endurance. Elias Boone Hardesty led on foot now, his mule, roped close behind. The map rode tucked in an oilskin at his chest, a heartbeat of parchment against his ribs. Behind him came François Leclerc, Baptiste Duval, and Little Elk, their faces gray with exhaustion. They had lost one mule and most of their powder to a river crossing gone wrong, and the mountains seemed to close in tighter each night. They reached a basin at dusk, a bowl of snow, and stone where wind never stopped moving. The sun was a pale coin sinking behind the ridges, and the cold carried a sound like breaking glass. Hardesty called a halt and pointed toward a rock overhang at the basin's edge. "There," he said. "We can make camp out of the wind." Leclerc gave a low whistle. "Looks like a grave, not a camp." Hardesty smiled thinly. "Most good camps do." They built a small fire from green pine and dead willow. The smoke crawled sideways, choking the air. Supper was dry meat, chewed in silence. Snow hissed against the rocks. Little Elk crouched apart, staring at the mountains that ringed them. "This place has bad bones," he murmured. "Old ones. You feel it?" Hardesty nodded. "Aye. But bones mean something lived here once." At dawn, the storm broke like glass through the sky. The wind screamed down from the peaks and brought the mountain with it. The first avalanche began high above a whisper that turned to thunder. Hardesty shouted, but the sound vanished in the roar. The wall of snow struck like surf. The mules disappeared. Baptiste was thrown to the ground, his cries drowned. When it ended, silence hit harder than the noise. The whole basin lay buried, smooth as unbroken paper. Hardesty clawed his way free, gasping. His face bled from a cut he hadn't felt. Leclerc crawled from the drift beside him, coughing ice. "Baptiste!" he shouted. No answer, only the hiss of wind. They dug until their hands bled, but there was nothing, no body, no mule, no sound. The mountain had taken its payment. When exhaustion made digging useless, Hardesty staggered to the rock ledge where Little Elk had sought shelter. The crow was alive, though his arm hung limp. He pointed upward. The mountain spoke. "You heard." Hardesty sank down beside him, breathing hard. If it spoke, it wasn't with mercy. Little Elk stared at the white expanse. Mercy is for the flat country, not here. By nightfall they had built a shelter from the wreckage, half snow, half pine boughs, shaped like the Shoshone lodges Hardesty had studied that winter. The memory of their design saved them now. Arched walls, packed drifts, a vent for the fire. Inside, the air warmed by degrees. Steam rose from their clothes as the ice melted. Leclerc sat staring at the flames, his face hollow. 3 men left now. And for what? To chase the grave of Spaniards? Hardesty said nothing. He pulled the map from its oilskin, smoothing it with shaking hands. The inked mountains looked eerily like the ridges outside their shelter. The Cross Mina del Sol lay only a few miles north, by the map's reckoning. Leclerc leaned forward, eyes sharp with bitterness. "You still mean to go on?" Hardesty met his gaze. "I didn't come this far to turn back." Little Elk, his arm bound in strips of hide, murmured, "The fire sleeps under the white." The friars woke at once. The mountain closed to keep it dreaming. Hardesty traced the red mark with his finger. "Then maybe it's time we saw what they found." The next day dawned blue and cruel. They left the shelter at first light, the snow crust cracking under their moccasins. Each breath stung, their beards glittered with frost. By midday they reached a narrow gorge that cut into the ridge like a wound. The snow here was thin, swept by wind. At its mouth stood a slab of stone, half buried but carved unmistakably by hand, a cross flanked by a circle of rays. The same sunburst as the metal Arroyo had given him. Leclerc stopped dead. "There's your accursed mark." "You satisfied?" Hardesty knelt, brushing snow from the carving. "Satisfied?" "No, but I know we're close." He followed the gorge upward. The air smelled faintly of sulfur. When he touched the rock, it was warm. Steam rose from cracks where the sun hadn't reached. "Volcanic," he murmured. "Hot ground." Leclerc backed away. "That's the fire, Elias." "The one sleeping. Let it lie." Hardesty turned, eyes alight. "Don't you see? This is the truth of it. They weren't chasing gold, they found something older. Fire trapped under ice. The earth's own heart." Little Elk shook his head slowly. "And it will burn those who wake it." As the sun dropped, they made camp near the gorge mouth. The ground trembled faintly, like breath under skin. The wind moaned through the cracks in the rock, and sometimes, beneath it, Hardesty thought he heard voices chanting, faint and rhythmic, as though carried from deep below. Leclerc refused the fire, muttering prayers. Little Elk slept facing the mountains, knife in hand. Hardesty sat awake, staring at the parchment laid flat beside the fire. The red cross glowed softly in the flickering light. He reached into his coat and drew out Arroyo's medal. The silver sunburst was warm again, as though alive. He set it beside the map. For an instant, the fire reflected between them, twin flames, one drawn, one real. Outside, the wind shifted. From far up the ridge came a low rumble, too steady for thunder. The mountain groaned. Hardesty rose and stepped to the gorge. Steam curled from the fissures like breath from a dying beast. He felt the heat on his face, the same heat that had lured Spaniards a lifetime ago. Behind him, Leclerc stirred and muttered, "You'll die chasing a ghost's warmth." Hardesty smiled faintly. "Maybe, but at least I'll know it was real." The fire flared, then sank. Snow fell again, soft and endless, burying their footprints before morning. When the thaw came, it came, like a breaking fever. For weeks the snow had groaned under its own weight, riddled with hidden veins of water, until one morning it simply gave way. Streams burst from the hillsides, roaring down into the gorge where Elias Boone Hardesty and his 2 surviving companions waited out the end of winter. The wind had changed. It smelled not of death now, but of wet earth and sulphur. Leclerc was sick, his breath ragged and shallow. A cough had hollowed him out. Little Elk tended the fire, his face grim. The avalanche had cost them nearly everything, their traps, their mules, half their powder. What remained was the map and the stubborn will that still lived behind Hardesty's eyes. Each day, as the ice retreated, the earth revealed new scars. Black rock jutted through the melting snow, streaked with mineral veins that shimmered faintly in the light. Steam rose in places where no fire burned. When Hardesty touched the ground, it felt warm beneath the skin of frost. The fire sleeps. Here, Little Elk said softly, kneeling beside him. Your Spaniards dug too deep, the mountain remembers. Hardesty didn't answer. He was staring at a shape that had begun to emerge from the ice ahead, an arch of stone, half buried, half formed, unmistakably carved by human hands. Around its rim were the same sunburst markings seen on Arroyo's metal. Leclerc coughed and spat blood into the snow. You found it, he rasped. Congratulations. Now let's get the hell out. But Hardesty only moved forward, one slow step at a time, as if drawn by a gravity older than reason. The arch was no larger than a doorway, its entrance sealed by ice that glowed a faint, unnatural blue. He pressed his palm against it. The surface was slick, but warm meltwater hissed beneath his hand. Help me, he said. Little Elk hesitated. If we open it, we wake what sleeps. Hardesty met his eyes. Then we'll let it speak. Together they chipped at the ice with the butts of their rifles. The sound echoed down the gorge like the ringing of iron on a bell. When at last the barrier broke, a rush of air came out hot, mineral, thick with the scent of ash and something metallic. Inside lay darkness, and within that darkness the glint of worked stone. They entered crouching. The walls of the tunnel were lined with timbers long petrified, their grain blackened by centuries. A few paces in, Hardesty found what he'd both hoped and feared to see. A rusted pickaxe, its handle carved with the Spanish cross. Beyond it lay the remains of a human figure, little more than bones wrapped in fragments of wool robe. A rosary dangled from its ribs. Leclerc's voice cracked. Mother of God! Hardesty knelt beside the skeleton, brushing away frost from a small iron box clutched in its hands. He pried it open. Inside were 2 things, a silver medallion identical to Arroyo's and a scrap of parchment sealed in wax. The ink had faded to ghost gray, but he could still read a few words. Lux dormia, subnive. The light sleeps beneath the snow. He exhaled slowly. They found it. Not gold. Fire. Little Elk stood at the mouth of the tunnel, eyes wary. Fire of the world's heart. You see now. They came to steal it, but it buried them. Hardesty stared into the darkness that stretched beyond. The tunnel dipped sharply downward, and from its depths came a low, steady hum, a living sound, the earth breathing in heat. Leclerc gripped his shoulder. We're done here, Elias. Whatever's down there belongs to no man. For the first time in months, Hardesty felt the weight lift. The obsession that had carried him across plains, through hunger and storms, turned suddenly hollow. He looked again at the friar's bones, at the melted rosary, and understood. Maybe that's the truth of it, he said quietly. They came for gold, and found God instead burning in the dark. He placed the silver medal in the dead man's hands, closed the box, and rose. We leave it as we found it. By the time they stepped back into daylight, the sky had cleared. The glacier above was weeping itself into rivers, the gorge alive with meltwater. Hardesty watched the arch collapse behind them as the ice shifted, sealing the tunnel again with a groan like the closing of a book. Leclerc stumbled, coughing hard, but a faint smile tugged at his lips. So ends your map of myth. Hardesty nodded. Aye, but it led us to something real, all the same. They turned east, following the runoff down toward the Big Horn. Behind them, the mountains steamed in the sun, smoke rising from fissures where ice met fire. The parchment he carried was ruined now, its ink bled into oblivion. Yet he didn't mind. The lines had already burned themselves into his memory, and perhaps that was enough. As they descended into the valley, Little Elk looked back once and murmured, "The fire sleeps again." Hardesty adjusted his hat against the wind. Let it sleep. And with that, the mountains swallowed their secret once more. The riverfront smelled of tar, horses, and heat. Keelboats groaned against the current, the wharves loud with the cursing of roustabouts unloading crates of lead shot, furs, and whiskey. Street. Louis had swollen in the 3 years since Elias Boone Hardesty had last seen it. The frontier had begun to civilize itself, and even the mud of the levee looked domesticated beneath the planks of the new landing. He dismounted stiffly, the long ride from the plains still in his bones. The horse he rode was borrowed, the rifle on his saddle old but cared for. Of the 4 men who had ridden north from Fort Bonneville 2 springs ago, only he and Little Elk had returned alive. They had come down the Yellowstone, then the Missouri, following water all the way to the city where the West emptied its stories. Hardesty looked smaller now, thinner, but his eyes still carried that iron gleam. He'd left the mountains with no gold, no relics, just a bundle of sketches, the friar's parchment sealed again in oilcloth, and a journal that had survived flood, snow, and grief. The lines in that book were worth more than silver to him. Little Elk rode behind on a bay mare. His hair was braided and tied with red cloth. He wore a trader's vest, but no hat. He gazed at the streets with quiet amazement. "Too many lodges," he murmured, "too many fires in one place." Hardesty smiled. "That's civilization for you." The Crow said nothing, only shook his head. They took lodging above a tannery on the edge of town. For the first time in months, Hardesty slept in a bed, but his dreams were of thunder under the ground and the faint glow of fire breathing beneath ice. When morning came, he found his hands had drawn maps on the sheets in his sleep rivers, peaks, crosses, ghost lines that vanished with the light. He dressed carefully and walked to the riverfront offices of a man he once knew, Major Ethan Farnsworth, former Army surveyor, now an agent for the Western Expansion Company. Farnsworth was gray and solid, with spectacles that made him look perpetually disappointed. When Hardesty stepped in, Farnsworth looked up and frowned. "I'll be damned. I thought the mountains had eaten you." "Nearly did," Hardesty said. He laid a bundle of sketches on the desk. "I've brought something you might find useful." Farnsworth untied the string, spreading the pages. Maps unfolded hand-drawn valleys, drainage basins, and the intricate lattice of the Wind River Range rendered with astonishing precision. Beside them were drawings of Shoshone lodges, avalanche shelters, and notes on snow compaction and airflow. "You did these?" Farnsworth asked, astonished. "Aye, fieldwork from last winter." The old surveyor leaned closer. "These contour lines, accurate to the yard, by my eye. How'd you manage that without instruments?" "Observation," Hardesty said simply. "And patience. Learned some of it from the Shoshone. They know how a hill breathes before a storm, how the snow packs. Their lodges are built to survive what ours never could." Farnsworth nodded slowly, tapping the edge of a drawing. "This is fine work, Hardesty. The Army Topographical Bureau would pay well for copies. We're charting the Rockies again next year." Hardesty hesitated. "I didn't come to sell maps." The Major raised an eyebrow. "Then why bring them?" Hardesty reached into his coat and placed the ruined Spanish parchment on the desk. The ink had faded into rust-red veins, but the cross and the sunburst still glimmered faintly. "This," he said, "is the reason men die chasing shadows. I want it kept where it can't be used for that again." Farnsworth studied the brittle sheet. "Spanish hand, no doubt. I've seen a dozen like it treasure maps from Mexico to the Sangre de Cristos." "This one led to bones in the snow," Hardesty said, quietly. "There's no gold there, only heat and death. I'd rather it lie in a cabinet than in a saddlebag." The surveyor looked at him for a long time, then nodded. "Smithsonian's agents are collecting frontier materials. I can see it delivered." "Good." Hardesty exhaled, the sound halfway between relief and sorrow. "Then my debt to it's paid." Outside, the city shimmered in the midday glare. He walked down to the levee, bought a coffee boiled black as pitch, and sat watching the current. Little Elk joined him silently. "You gave them the map," the Crow said after a time. "I did." Little Elk nodded. So the fire sleeps again. Hardesty smiled faintly. Aye, and may it rest longer than I do. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the calls of boatmen and the groan of timbers. Then Little Elk reached into his pouch and drew out a small token, the friar's iron box, cleaned and wrapped in hide. He placed it in Hardesty's hand. "Keep this," he said. "Your ghosts should travel with you. They will not hurt you now." Hardesty weighed the box. It felt heavy, not with gold, but with memory. He tucked it into his satchel. "You heading north again?" "Yes. The Crow Mountains are calling." "Too much noise here." Hardesty nodded. "You'll have peace there. I'll find mine here, or try." They clasped forearms, the mountain man and the plain scout, the grip of brothers forged in cold and hunger. When Little Elk walked away into the crowd, his figure blended with the dust and sunlight until it was gone. Weeks passed. Hardesty took a room above a cobbler's shop, spent his days sketching the maps clean for Farnsworth's copies. Word spread that an old trapper with a scholar's hand had mapped the Wind River better than any Army engineer. Students from the small academy came to see him, eager to learn his native geometry. He taught them what he could, how snow-load bends timber, how wind carves valleys, how patience draws more truth than instruments. One evening a young surveyor asked, "Did you ever find what you were looking for, Mr. Hardesty?" He smiled. "Yes and no. The mountain showed me that some fires are meant to stay buried." He picked up his quill again, drawing the curve of a glacier with sure, steady lines. The ink flowed smooth, confident. For the first time in years his hand did not tremble. Outside, the bells of Street Louis tolled against the sunset, echoing like the river's pulse. He looked out the window, half expecting to see the peaks rise beyond the horizon. Instead, he saw the slow, eternal current of the Missouri, brown and wide and full of secrets. The map on his desk was nearly complete. At its center, where the Spanish parchment had once shown a red cross, he drew a small circle instead, a sun half hidden behind the line of a ridge. Beneath it he wrote, in a careful hand, "Here, the fire sleeps beneath the snow." Then he set down the pen, leaned back, and let the lamplight wash across the page. The map was no longer a lure, it was a testament. In that quiet room above the cobbler's shop, with the city murmuring below and the smell of river mud drifting through the shutters, Elias Boone Hardesty finally understood he was not the man who found the mine. He was the man who drew the map, and that was enough.